like, well, there's very much. So hi everyone, so let's get started. So first, so just a little advertising for the for the Utah Day Science Day. It's the first Friday of the spring semester, so you should all be around and not too busy with everything yet. So this will be the first time we've done this. So since COVID, we had planned for it last year, and then there was like the Omicron surge. So we canceled it, but we had done it so a number of times before. It was a lot of stuff, talks about day science. There's going to be like so we have really exciting, keynote speaker. There's going to be like a career fair where recruiting companies. There's going to be like a research expo where cool stuff you've done. You can show off a demo or a poster. So you can also come and just,
don't come in
and observe everything. You don't have to present anything.
11.
So if you're interested, go ahead and sign up. So it should be a lot of fun. So I'm just curious about how well the advertising we've done of this work. So who knew about this already, and who had not seen about this before? Okay. So are you guys on the Canvas page for like the computer science majors and like data science majors? Okay.
So much on there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's the only like mechanism we have to send out to you. There's not so much on there. It's like 2 things a week. It's not so bad. Okay. No. On the Canvas page just for the school computing. Like I get all those announcements too. So I'm signed up for that. So it's okay. Okay. I know it shows up with all your other messages from Instructure. So all right. Okay. All right. Well, so this is gonna be a cool thing. Hope all you go. So tell your friends. And if you have a better suggestion of how we can let you know about stuff, so that'd be great. So doing stuff on TikTok, I have no idea. So no. So is that a yes? So if you laugh, that's like approval? No, that's okay. Negative views. Okay. All right. Well. Okay. Yeah. All right. So the topic today is going to be kind of the most popular algorithm for clustering for the k-means clustering formulation called Lloyd's algorithm. This will be most what we talked about today. It's mostly the core idea is quite simple. We'll go through it, but it's kind of like with the SVD and the eigendecomposition, as maybe some of you have found out in the homework. There are lots of if you try and do it yourself, sometimes there are some weird things that happen, and so we'll talk about those kind of weird things. And so how to understand how to how to use it. So the other thing, let's see on the schedule. Yeah. So homework 4 was originally due today. I left it there on the calendar, but I extended the deadline by 2 days. There was, I think, only 20 people had turned it in last night at the point I extended it. A lot of people are having lots of questions on it, so hopefully this will be appreciated. Then we'll probably be a little bit slow in the grading. Might not start till like after Thanksgiving break or maybe a little bit before, but don't expect anything until after Thanksgiving on the. So the feedback on this, you've actually basically already had your quiz on that material, so you'll definitely get back before the final and everything. Okay. And then there's not a quiz next week because it's going to be Thanksgiving anyway. So there's a bigger gap between quizzes. So hopefully this kind of eases your schedules a little bit. Typically, homework 5 is not as challenging. We'll get that out so soon, and that'll cover clustering and classification. Yeah. So yeah, you're almost done. You guys have learned a lot so far. But there's some cool stuff left. Okay. Great. So let's talk about clustering. All right. So we've generally been, just to review, we've been talking about this type of clustering, assignment-based clustering. Okay, and with the lecture on Tuesday next week, in addition to the kind of mixture of Gaussians, which is more or less an assignment-based, it's a little extension of that. We'll also probably see kind of a mean shift clustering. There's kind of a totally different way of thinking about clustering. But this, the input here is going to be a set of points X, which are going to be in RD. And so we'll use distance between from RD to RD. And in fact, we'll use the Euclidean distance. For k-means, you more or less need to use the Euclidean distance. There are some variations that work, but it works best with Euclidean distance, and we'll see why. All right, and some value k. So it should be the number of clusters. So this will be the number of clusters. And I'll talk later in this lecture about, how do you choose the value k? And there's not going to be a great answer, but I'll give you kind of about as good of an answer as you can hope for. And so the goal is going to be a set of k, sites S, S1, S2 up to SK. This is going to be a subset of, subset of RD, right? So these are going to be k points. And so we want to find S star, which is going to be arg min over sets of size k. That is going to minimize the sum of squared errors, right? So this is going to be the sum from 1 to n of xi minus the projection or the mapping to the closest site. So the sum of the squared errors here, right? And so we talked about most of last week on Thursday last week was talking about this phi of s function. So phi of s x is the closest site sj to x, right? So this is going to be the arg min sj in the set S of sj minus x. Okay, so if you draw a picture of the sites S1, S2, S3, S4, and you have some data point x here, then you're going to find the closest site, and it's going to return site S1 here, right? And the cost, if you look at the cost function, so this guy is going to be, we're going to call this cost of x s. Okay, so this is going to be our cost function. Okay, so it's going to be looking at each of these. So it's going to be looking at each of these distances from xi to the closest site, right? So this distance here is going to be our residual. So this will be ri, which is the distance from xi to phi of s of xi. Right, so it's this distance here, and if we have a whole bunch of these points, right, we're going to be collecting all of these distances, and we want to minimize all of these distances onto the closest site. Okay. All right. So and what this does is the sites which are mapped onto the same, or the points which are mapped onto the same sites, these are going to be the clusters. So we're grouping together the points based on their assignment to the closest cluster. So all these points are grouped together in these clusters here, right? And we had talked about how this induces this this like Voronoi diagram, which is this partition of the plane, right? Or a partition of RD in general, but partition of the plane. These drawings where I know of which cell of this green, partition I'm in, it tells me the assignment of the points. Okay, and that's induced by this phi of s function here. Okay, and that gets messier in higher dimensions, but we can just calculate, kind of check against all the sites. Usually k is not so large. We can just check. All right, so this was the goal of the k-means clustering. I had mentioned there are other formulations in the assignment base. I can do the sum of the distances instead of the sum of the squared distances, or minimize the maximum distance. And there are other algorithms for these formulations. This is the one that's most commonly used. This is the this one is associated with k-means. This formulation, and it's mostly because there's an algorithm that is very kind of neat and kind of like simple to write down and to think about. Whereas for the other methods, the other formulations, the sum of the distances or the max distance or some other stuff, that's kind of a little bit harder to optimize. There are a couple steps that don't quite translate in the same way as k-means, as we'll see in this. So we're going to talk about what's called Lloyd's algorithm, which is the most common algorithm for this sort of problem. There are other algorithms. So Lloyd's algorithm actually has, in some ways, it's not great in that you can't really guarantee very strong things about it. It might not give you a very good answer. There are other algorithms that are guaranteed to give you a good answer, but they're much more complicated and much slower in order to get those guarantees. So everyone just uses Lloyd's algorithm in general, or some flavor of that. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in this lecture. Okay. All right. So Lloyd's algorithm. And so Lloyd Stuart Lloyd was a researcher at like IBM, and this algorithm, apparently he wrote up a draft of a paper in like 1957, and he didn't ever publish it. He didn't finish his experiments. Computers were changing, and then but it was circulating around some people, and eventually he published in like 1982. There's like a 15-year gap, and by then it had kind of realized that it was it was like a useful thing to do. I think the algorithm was initially just in one dimension, but now people use it in much higher dimensions. We'll draw pictures in 2D. I think it captures most of what's going on aside from the complexity of the Voronoi diagram. So what is Lloyd's algorithm? All right, so the first thing is to initialize, and this is going to be another one of these algorithms that's iterating towards the right solution. So we're going to need an initialization step, and then we're going to do stuff on like an iteration. And to initialize, we're going to choose k points, and I'm going to say specifically S subset of X. Okay, I'm not going to say how to do this right now. Maybe we'll come back to this. You could initialize possibly a different way, but this is how we're going to talk about initializing. And then I'm going to repeat. So 2 steps. Okay. So these are going to be the sites, right? So these are the S are going to be. I'm going to choose a subset of points. Those are going to be my guess of the centers of the clusters. Okay, and then so for all xi in X, right? So all of the data points, I want to assign xi to xj. Okay, this is going to be uppercase xj. And so this is going to be a cluster, the jth cluster. So I'm going to think of the cluster is going to be indexed by j and the points indexed by I. So phi of s of xi is equal to site j, right? So I'm going to map it, assign to the jth cluster so that site j is the closest point, right? So I'm going to assign every point to its closest site, and that defines what cluster it's in. I'm going to give this a set, right? So this is defining the jth, so subset of X, or cluster, right? So it's assigned to the jth cluster, okay? And then, okay, so but that was given on a guess of the right sites, and the sites might not be I may not have done the right guess here. Okay, so I then need to update the choice of the sites, right? So for all Sj in S, I'm going to update Sj is going to get to what's going to be the average of all the points in the jth cluster. Okay, so this is what this is doing, is taking the points in the jth cluster, which I know those are the ones supposedly captured by the site, and I'm going to move Sj to the average of these, right? So remember, X is our vector, so this is a vector average. But it's the same thing as the element-wise average, and that's the mean of the points in high dimensions. Okay, and then basically I'm going to say until kind of converged, or let's say T steps, or actually, I think I use R. Let's say R steps. Okay, so some number R of steps. I might set R to say R equals 10, or 20, right? So I might just run for usually 10 or 20 iterations. All right, so this is the algorithm. Once I initialize, and we'll talk about how to initialize, but that's not the key point here. I'm gonna iterate between these 2 steps, and they're both pretty simple and straightforward. The first one is every point I assign it to the closest site. That seems a reasonable thing to do. And the second step is the reason why you do use the k-means formulation. Why this works is that it makes sense to update the location of the site to the average of all the points that have been associated with it. Okay, of all the points associated with that site, we update the site to the average. Okay, so and it turns out that this is exactly the right thing to do. It's kind of the step that optimized our cost function I wrote on the previous slide, right? If I go back and look at this cost function here, that step is going to, the averaging is the right thing to do with that cost function. I'll kind of walk through that in a little bit more detail later. All right, so let's go through an example of this, but kind of the two steps are pretty simple, right? Okay, so let me try and write an example here. So let's say these are the points. Okay, so these are the, these are the data points, and I need to initialize with some centers. Okay, let's say my choice of my centers are let's try and make it a little bit interesting. Let's say it's so these points here. Okay, so these are the sites. I have 4, so K is equal to 4. This says S1, S2, S3, and S4. And I've initialized that the sites are actually so some of these data points. Okay, and they're kind of like, if you eyeball this, right, and if you're in 2D, you might be very just eyeballing it, and you don't necessarily need to run an algorithm if it looks like this. But for the purposes, there are kind of 4 clusters here, right? And there's one maybe outlier up top, right? So think of 1 cluster, 2, 3, 4, and then maybe an outlier point. Okay, so we'll kind of see what happens. Hopefully, I chose a good example here. But I haven't assigned the sites necessarily onto the right clusters, right? This cluster down here doesn't have any sites to it. So I haven't really assigned stuff in the right way. So in one way to, again, think about this, is to draw these, the Voronoi diagrams, okay? And so these are kind of the bisectors between these points. Let's see, set a bit of an angle just to make this easier to draw. And like this, okay, these are kind of the bisectors of these points. Okay, so what? And so the first step, right? Step A is kind of you can think of assigning all the black points onto the sites, and you can see that if I draw the Voronoi diagram, right? Then all of the points, say in here, right, in this cell, they're all assigned onto S3, right? So I kind of see which points are assigned to S3. This is probably not the right clustering I want, so I want to kind of adjust this clustering. And so I do that by recentering each of the sites into the center of the cluster it's currently trying to represent. Give it a better representation. So for instance, S1 was probably going to move to here, right? This will be the location of S1. It's centered along the data points instead of being somewhere on the edge. It does not need to be one of the data points, okay? Similarly, S4 is probably doing this. This is going well. But S3 and S2, they kind of have some work to do to kind of figure out what they're going to do with themselves. And S3 probably moves down here, and S4 is going to move this way as well. Let's make it maybe a little bit more interesting. Let's say S4 is here. Okay, it's kind of moving to the average. It's kind of splitting the difference in these things. And maybe S4 is shifting, and S3 are kind of shifting down towards them. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's S2. Great. Yeah. So, S2. Great. Okay. So now once I've done this, that was kind of the step B where I readjusted, updated the sites. And now I have a different assignment of these. There's a new Voronoi diagram. And so I'm intentionally not draw this completely perfect, just so we can run a couple more steps here. Okay, and okay, so now typically does not meet at a point like that. Let me here. All right, okay. So this would be like the Voronoi diagram of the updated points. And now I can reassign these slightly. Okay, so let's S1, now at that outlier point up here, this outlier point is now assigned to S1. So it's going to shift a little bit over here. S1. S2 is now mostly in the center of this cluster, right? So S2 is going to shift S here, and S3 is going to shift much closer down to the center of this guy. There's still a few kind of dangling points up here, and S4 is going to stay in the same spot. Okay. And now I can redraw these assignment boundaries. Now I'm basically properly splitting the difference between S2 and S3. S2 and S4 are going to kind of do something like this. S1 and S4 are going to split here, and S2 and S1 are going to have this sort of boundary. Okay, great. So S1 is going to be stable now in the same spot, right? S1 is staying in the same spot here. S4 is going to stay in the same spot again. S3 is now not going to have these kind of dangling points, so it's going to move really into the center here, S3, and S2 is going to move into a good center of these representative points. Okay, and then if I redraw these boundaries, this is going to be pretty similar. These are going to be the same, and this boundary will be the same. Okay, great. So now we've kind of gotten the clusters that we hoped. Okay, and if I keep running this, it's not going to change anymore. It's kind of gone stable, and I've pretty much assigned the points into the proper sort of clusters here. You can kind of see these points are in a cluster. These points are in a cluster. These points are in a cluster. And these points with this outlier are also in this cluster. Okay, right. So this is kind of a picture example of how the algorithm is run. Okay, question? Yeah.
Oh, is there any option that helps? Like clusters of clusters?
Oh, if a cluster say should be split into two clusters.
No, I mean like cluster.
Oh yeah, so if there's like a hierarchy of clusters. Yeah. Great, yeah. So there's a whole another branch of clustering called hierarchical clustering that's built on the idea that everything is kind of, there's a tree structure and you can chop off the tree anywhere, and that's the resolution of the clusters. And if you chopped it off lower in the tree, you get more clusters. Yeah, so you can think of it kind of like fractals, or kind of, like so if you have like a phylogenetic tree of species, right? You get clustering at different levels, right? If you cluster populations, okay, there's the different kind of cities within, Utah, and then there's the state of Utah, and then there's kind of the country United States and the different countries in the world. Kind of think these hierarchies exist naturally in many places. And so the hierarchical clustering tries to kind of capture that with data. We aren't going to talk about those in this course. They're covered in the book. The data mining class goes into these. These kind of, they don't necessarily, those are mostly procedural algorithms. They kind of, here's how you do this. What is it actually optimizing for? The assignment-based clustering have a much more clear way of thinking about that, where I'm minimizing the sum of the squared errors. And this is kind of natural, which in the theme of this class. So that's why we're kind of focusing on this version. Right. So, okay, question. So good question. So if I don't necessarily have a bunch of disjoint groups of points, right? And so I've kind of one kind of blob of points, but I run the algorithm with k equals 4. Is this going to converge? So the answer is, so yes. Yeah, so actually, and that's one of the things we're gonna so talk about here next. Yeah, great. So this is a good question. So does this converge? So does Lloyd's algo converge, right? So I said to run it until it converges, but can I guarantee it actually converges, right? So yeah, so this is a great question. And the way to think about this is to look at the cost function here, right? Remember this cost function, we wrote this as sum over xi and x, xi minus phi of s, xi squared, right? So this was our cost function. We have this residual of the mapping onto the closest site, and we're squaring it. But there's this other way you can alternatively write this, which will be useful to think about. I can also write this as the sum Sj and S over the sum of all the points x in cluster xj, right? So these are the points assigned to this cluster, and this is Sj minus x and this squared. Okay, so these are the same things. Every point is assigned to at least one of the clusters, or exactly one of the clusters, right? And so I'm still adding up their squared distances. I'm always mapping it onto the closest point, right? So so implicitly here, I have that if I have that kind of xj is the set of x in x, such that phi of sx equals sj. Okay, so I'm assigning, these are all the points that are assigned to the closest cluster or the closest site. So in this example, if this is going to be S1, then these points are X1, right? And if I have S2, then these points here are X2, right? So if I have this, then these are equivalent ways of writing the cost function. Okay, and so to argue that it converges, I want to say that I'm going to argue for the following property: every step, and by this I mean the A step, or so the B step, decreases cost. Okay, so if I look at this cost function, every step A or B always decreases this cost. Either that or it stops. Okay, if it stops decreasing the cost, then so then it has to be converged. Okay. So let's look at the two steps, right? If we remember, step A is for all x in our set X, I'm going to assign x to xj, so phi of s equals sj. Okay, so what is this doing? This step here, that's saying for the point x, sj is the closest point, right? So this is saying closest site. I'm assigning each point x onto the closest site. If I look at the cost function, if I look at this original sort of cost function here, that assignment is implied in here, right? Applying, but if that was the wrong assignment before, because I moved the sites, well, then this is decreasing the cost. If I move it to a closer site, then the cost has to decrease, right? Because I'm minimizing the residual, the closest site will have this smaller cost associated. Okay, so by reassigning to a site that's closer, given that the sites are fixed, then the cost, overall cost is decreasing. Okay, I can look at step B. Okay, this is for all Sj in S. What I'm going to do, I'm going to set Sj equals 1 over xj x in xj x. Okay, so I'm assigning it to the average of all the points. Okay, so I'm adjusting the site, and the claim is that this step also always decreases the cost. Okay, and to think about kind of this step, I want to look at just this part of the cost function here. Right, so I want to do this for each of the sites, and I'm not changing the assignment at this step. I'm not changing which data point is assigned to which of the sites. I'm just saying for the points that are assigned to that site, this is the better choice of where to put the representative points. And I want to minimize the sum of these squared errors. And I'm saying that the average, the coordinate-wise average, the vector average is the right thing to do, that this always decreases the cost function. Okay, so it turns out this is true. It turns out this is the argmin. It turns out that Sj, let's call this Sj star equals the arg, these are the same things, equals the arg min over S of x in xj of the distance from x to S. The sum of the squared distances. So if I minimize the sum of the squared distances from all the points in xj with S, I'm going to exactly get the average. We saw this before in one dimension, right? With when we were talking about this probabilistic formulation, when we assumed that there was normal noise on the data, and we found the maximum likelihood estimator of that, and this turned out to be just the min. It turns out so if you're in multiple dimensions, instead, let's say I've got a bunch of these points. These are the points xj, and I've got I want to assign center Sj. I want to minimize the sum of the squared distances. The right thing to do is to do an element-wise, average, right? So I can think of Sj1 and Sj2, right? And I can take the average of all the points onto the x-axis. Maybe I didn't draw that right now that I've drawn the points. Okay, good thing I can erase here. Okay, I want to take the average of these points. I'll say this is SJ1. The average on this is, say, the X1 coordinate, X2 coordinate. Okay, and then I do the same thing here. So I look at these individual coordinates, I take the average, right? And then I want to take this point here, which will be SJ star, which is the update. I'm going to argue that this is the best thing is the average. Okay, and one way to see this is that if I look at the distance from X to SJ, this is going to be equal to, let's say, the squared distance is going to be the absolute value from, or I don't need the absolute value. Okay, from X, let's say xi1 minus sj1 squared plus xi2 minus sj2 squared. So I look at, by the Pythagorean theorem, right, if I look at the distance here, I can break it down into two pieces, along the first coordinate and along the second coordinate, and the squared distance of the hypotenuse, which I care about, is what's minimizing the squared distance along the x and the y distance, right? And because of the orthogonality of these distances and so Pythagorean theorem, I can optimize the x and the y distances so separately. And we already saw that the coordinate that minimizes the x1 distance is the mean of those points, and it's same thing holds here, that if I do both of those, I take the element-wise mean, then this is the optimal of the sum of the squared distances. Yeah. Well, I'm kind of like the centering of each. I want to find the site at the center of each cluster. So I'm kind of like centering each cluster. I'm not centering the overall data. I don't need to do that, right? But I'm kind of doing something like centering here, right? I'm finding the center, and that's the kind of the point I measure all the points off of, right? If you remember, like the variance of a data set, you're measuring the average square distance from the mean. Well, that's kind of my cost function here is basically just the variance, right? It's the average square distance from the site, which is I'm putting exactly at the mean, right? So I'm kind of like doing something like centering here. Yeah, that's a good thing to think about, but I don't need to do that for the full data set. Okay, so I can do this element-wise, and this gives me the optimal, the thing that is minimizing this cost function if I look at it by one guess of the cluster at a time. Okay, so if I and this is particularly why we like to use the sum of the squared distances. If I were to minimize the distance, I couldn't necessarily decompose it this way. Finding the point that minimizes the distances to all the points instead of the squared distances is much more challenging. So this is called, I'm blanking on the name of this, but there's like a name for this problem because it's non-trivial. If I'm minimizing the sum of the distances, but minimizing the sum of the squared distances is just the average. So that makes the k-means formulation much easier to do. That's where it gets the name k-means, because the optimal solution is the mean of all the clusters that you've assigned stuff onto. Okay, so to put everything together now, I say that step A decreases the cost function, right? And that is the only thing that changes the assignments. Step B is the only thing that changes the sites, and that also decreases the cost function. Okay, so can I get into an infinite loop? Now I want to put this all together. Will it converge towards something? And if it doesn't converge, that means it's got into an infinite loop somehow. And there are versions of this. If I tweak the algorithm, it might get into an infinite loop. But I'm arguing this cannot get into an infinite loop. because the cost function must always decrease. So I can plot the cost function as I'm running the algorithm, and it can't go up. Okay, and that means that I cannot get back to a configuration I was at before. There's an infinite number of possible sites I could choose because the sites don't need to be data points, but the assignments of points onto clusters is so finite. So there's a finite number of assignments of partitions of the data, and I can't visit any of those partitions twice. Okay, so it's finite, but it's a really big number. And actually, there are these weird configurations people have come up with where you actually visit like an exponential number of ways of splitting the data. Typically does not happen, but people have generated data in really weird configurations where this happens. And it almost, but the cost function is always decreasing. And most times after 10 to 20 steps, if it hasn't already stopped, then it already converged, so it can't update anymore, then it will be just about in the right position. Okay, so this must always converge because the cost function always decreases, right? It's decreasing this cost function every step. So because of that, it can't go back to someplace it was before, and it can't get into an infinite loop. Okay, great. So that's the good news. This is the good news about kind of Lloyd's algorithm for k-means clustering. It's very simple to do. Every step is decreasing the cost, and it's converging. It doesn't get into any of these infinite loops, right? So it's doing something, but it's not. It doesn't always give the right answer. Okay. Here, so let me give an example here. So let's say I've got all right, and so let's say let's say k is equal to 4. Okay, and I'd like to find the best thing for k equals 4 clusters. You should be able to see, this is so this is optimal, right? So if I pick the 4 centers here, right? Green and black look similar. Let me highlight these. Okay. But let's say I initialize somehow so that I chose, or even not worrying how I initialize, that this was S1. Let's say this was S2. This was S3. And this was S4. Okay, so what's going to happen? The Voronoi diagram is going to look like this. Okay, and S3 is the center of all the points in its cluster. S2 is the center of the points in its cluster. S1 is the center of the points in its cluster, and S4 is the center of points in its cluster. Okay, this algorithm is so stuck. Yeah.
Is there only like as many sections of a Voronoi diagram?
So yes, yeah. So exactly every site gives rise to one cell in the Voronoi diagram.
Is there a way to know how many pages you use?
I will try and answer this a little bit later in the lecture. That's one of the next points I want to get to. Yeah. So how do you choose K, for instance, right? So I want to finish discussing this, and then we'll talk about initializing, and then so then we'll get to that. Yeah. So the point is, Lloyd's Lloyd's algorithm is not so guaranteed to find the the optimal solution. Okay, this Lloyd's algorithm will stop in this purple configuration I've drawn here. So if I get to that configuration, which it's not unreasonable, if I started with one site on that side, one site here, and two sites up there, because these points that are S1 has kind of gathered are so much closer together than they are further away from S2 and S3, then it's hard for one of those sites in S2 or S3 to navigate over to S1, where all the points in S1. So it kind of gets stuck like this. This isn't the only way it can get stuck, but this is kind of somewhat easy way to see how it can be stuck here. Okay, so it's not guaranteed to find the optimal solution. Just kind of think about the function. If you think about this in terms of convexity and gradient descent, if you can kind of try and formulate this as something like a gradient descent algorithm. It's closer to what we'll call an EM algorithm we'll talk about on Thursday. But it's not so convex. Okay, if I were to write this down as a formulation, there are k points that each have d coordinates. I have k times d parameters. And if I look in that k times d parameter space, it's not convex in that space. So I can't guarantee it I'll find a single. So the local minimum is the same as the global minimum. That's not guaranteed to be true for this formulation because I don't have convexity. All right. So what should we do about this? Actually, let's take a small break, and then we'll come back in, let's say, in 3 minutes or a little more if you need it. But think about what you could do because of this problem, right? And then we'll come back and we'll start with your ideas and we'll walk through them, and then we'll try and address the how do you choose K.
We're going to come back and talk about starting goals. Is it possible to select the same point of movie?
It's possible, yeah.
So
That would cause yeah. So this is one of the reasons I don't suggest you to implement this on your own, right? That could happen. You could actually accidentally have that the two sites, average to on top of each. Actually, that probably won't happen, but that they will. You could have a site actually have like no points assigned to it, right? There's a weird stuff that can happen like this, and your implementation has to deal with that. Otherwise, and so typically, if that happens, where something weird happens, they will take that site and they'll reassign it someplace else. You have to detect something weird happened, and then you have to reassign one of the sites. Typically, what you would do, a common strategy is to kind of find the center, the cluster that either has the most variance or the most number of points, and randomly pick one of the points in that cluster, and that usually works pretty well. It takes the big clusters and splits them apart. So that could actually work here. If the S1 cluster is one with the most variance and the most points, well, then I randomly pick a point for the assignment of S3, and then it'll optimize. It's not guaranteed to do that, but in practice, that generally works fairly well.
Can you say that one?
Convex, yeah. Yeah, so you have to think about this in the function setting, right? We want to optimize the cost function, right? And I can think of the things I can choose are the sites, and there are k sites and d coordinates for each site. So that's k times d parameters. So I can write this cost function down in terms of those k times d coordinates, and then I can and then I can look at this cost function. And that function, if I were to draw it, it'd have many potential local minimum, not just a single. And so it's and then it's also not going to be convex. Yeah. This step, just the purple part, that part is convex, right? So that's what I can solve here, but I can't solve the whole formulation as a convex problem. All right, great. So, all right, so great. So what should we do about this? So how can we fix, what are ideas we could have to try and address the issue that Lloyd's algorithm does not necessarily converge to the right, so not always the right solution. Okay, so let's I want to hear some so some ideas from you. Address non-optimal, so convergence. So it's guaranteed to converge to something, but that might not be the global optimum, right? So how do we address this non-optimal convergence? Okay, you're discussing about how much fun you had on the weekend instead of, that's fine, but now think about this a little bit, all right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the most like when you said before.
Okay, so you're saying try, I'm going to change this a little bit, try more initializations. Right, so this is good. This idea is called random restart. Okay, so I somehow want to, I don't want to try all of them because it's like n choose k, which is n to the power k roughly, which is pretty big. But I probably don't need all of them. There are probably a lot of good ones out there, right? So if I were to choose one of the good ones, then it'll hopefully converge to the right thing. This is called random restarts. I somehow need to randomize that choice, right? And this would somehow, and I would say, so I want to add try more random initializations. So that would often be the idea of just picking k points at random. There could be other ways of doing that, but k initial random initializations is a great way to do it. I run each one to completion or for 10 or 20 steps, and I see which one has the smallest cost function. Whichever one has the smallest cost function, that's the one I keep. Right? This is a simple idea. This is very common. Great. Okay. That's part of the solution. It's not necessarily all of the best solution. What could be another idea? Yeah. Oh, all right, great. So better initialization. Okay, and there are kind of a couple ideas here that are common. What you described is always kind of pick the furthest point away, and this is called like Gonzalez algorithm. And this is actually optimized for k-center clustering, where you always want to minimize the maximum distance. And you always kind of pick the furthest site away from everything you've seen before. I won't describe it in too much detail. There's another version of this, which is Gonzalez algorithm is maybe 30 years old. There's another algorithm that came up only about 10 years old, called k-means plus plus, okay? Yeah, this is from C++ was popular, and it's still popular, but this is kind of like always picking the furthest point away, but you want to mix it with the first idea, so you want to randomize that. And so what you do is you kind of look at all the distances from points to existing sites, and you and you square them, and then you pick proportional to that length. And I'm not going to get into all the details. These are in the book. The data mining class goes into these in more detail. But this k-means plus plus, this is actually tuned well for the k-means formulation, and it's randomized, so I can do random initializations. If I did the furthest point approach, this is deterministic. There's only one way I can do that, right? So this one is randomized as well. And it's kind of known that if you rerun k-means plus plus with something like 10, some number of random initializations, it's guaranteed that with high probability, one of them will be somewhat close to something near optimal. It's really hard to state formal things in this problem, but this says some actual guarantees about how well it will work. Right, so this is a great idea. Yeah, so any other ideas? You have a similar, yeah. Yep.
I had a question about Gonzalez. I mean, that's gonna, if you have an outlier, this is an outlier. Is that a problem?
Oh yeah, we'll choose outliers. That's a good point. Yeah, it's optimized for the case center, and the case center actually cares about outliers, so it helps identify. So maybe that's good, maybe that's not good. These are really interesting modeling questions about what you want to do with the algorithm and what it actually means. And great things to keep in mind. And there isn't an answer, this is the right or the wrong thing to do. They're sometimes right, sometimes wrong. Yeah, so it's a good thing to keep in mind. These, even k-means can get stuck in outliers. That can also happen. Yep.
Could you introduce like randomness so you find the average at each step and slowly decrease the amount of average?
Oh, okay, yeah, so yeah, this is an interesting idea. So randomize the averaging step, right? And do something like simulated annealing, which if you've taken the AI class, there's this search mechanism where you start by jumping around a lot and have a lot of randomness, and then as you kind of settle, you decrease the randomness, and then eventually it becomes more deterministic, and hopefully it's converged to the right thing. This is called a simulated annealing sort of approach, and I have not seen this explored much. It's an interesting idea. It's a very popular strategy for non-convex optimization problems. And before, in deep nets, when people said, I don't care about the non-convexity, I'm just going to find a local minimum, this was kind of the dominant way of thinking about this thing. So it's a really interesting idea. Yep. Yeah, so other ways to inject randomness in here to avoid these situations. This comes up in a lot of these kind of problems where, in this case, the hard examples are really weird. And so if you randomize out of the weirdness a little bit, it might just work. And so that's a pretty interesting idea. Okay, I'm going to add one additional idea that is also common, that will kind of lead into our next point. So use more clusters. So K prime, which is say much bigger than K. So often you might think of like K prime equals K log N, might be a common choice here. So merge. Okay, so I'm going to run with a lot more clusters, right? Have more clusters than I ultimately want. And probably every cluster will get broken down to some number of pieces. It'll be much harder to miss something. And then once I have all these smaller clusters, then I can kind of group them together pretty well. And that might be easier to do. How exactly do the merge? Not going to get into, but this is another idea that leads to some stability of the sort of issues that we talked about. Okay, so there are a number of ways to deal with this. Which one is the best? K-means plus plus is now built into a lot of libraries. And so with random restarts, that's probably the dominant way of approaching this. So kind of a mixture of 2B and 1 is kind of the most common approach, but these other approaches are also sometimes the right way right way to do it. Is there a question or a stretch over here? Okay, that's a stretch. All right. Okay. Okay. So one more important point that I kept saying I was going to get to, how to choose K. Okay. Right. So yeah, so we've had these hyperparameters before, which are kind of parameters which are given to you, but you don't really explain why. So they're given to you. We had a parameter before in polynomial regression, right? The degree of the polynomial. And with polynomial regression, we could solve for the degree using cross-validation. You held out some data and you saw how well different choices of P performed on the data that was so held out. That's harder to do here, okay? Because I don't have, this is an unsupervised problem, okay? And if I were to increase K, right? Remember, I wrote down my goal is this cost function of X and S, right? Okay, and so what's going to happen to this cost function as I increase K? Yep. Yeah, it's always just going to go down. Adding another, if I have a fixed set of sites and I add another one, it can't increase the cost function, right? It just makes that there's some points might be closer to the new site I've added. So I can always decrease the cost function as I, right? So if I write down K on the x-axis and I write down the cost of X, let's say S star, the optimal set of sites, what's going to happen is that the cost function is going to look something like this. It's always going to decrease. It's always going to be decreasing as K is larger. Okay, so cross-validation is when what would typically happen, although in over-parameterized things I mentioned is sometimes different, but in cross-validation it comes back up at some point because I kind of see the effect of overfitting. Okay, but that's not ever going to happen here. Eventually, when K is equal to N, right? K is equal to N, the cost will be exactly 0, right? So then cost of X S star is going to be 0. I assign a site to every one of the points. This doesn't give me any some meaning here. Okay, so what do I do here? In fact, a similar situation happens with doing so PCA. I'm in high dimensions. I want to project down to a low dimension. How many dimensions, should I choose? There, the answer was something like, well, in low, if I get down to 2 dimensions, for instance, I can draw a picture, and that's pretty cool, right? But if I wasn't if I didn't have a point where there's a special value 2 that was really nice somehow, then I didn't have a good answer there either. And the similar sort of situation happened. The error would keep going down as the number of dimensions increased. So this is a similar issue here. Okay. All right, so what's the right thing to do here? There are ways to formulate this so statistically, and you can kind of say, okay, how well does this fit the data? And you can kind of say, I'm assuming an underlying model here, and we'll see with mixture of Gaussians that you actually assign a model, a Gaussian on top of some points, and does that fit well? I can kind of try and estimate this. There are some ways to do this that work, and I'm not going to get into those. for k-means clustering, you don't actually have this generated model. So this doesn't make sense, and it doesn't necessarily work for, at least not as easily for the dimensionality reduction. What we're going to talk about instead is the elbow approach. Okay. Okay, and the way to think about this is that, okay, I've got a hand down here, and this is an arm, and I'm not joking here. And right here, this is the elbow. Maybe I had a W on there. Okay, the elbow, and so this point here, right in the elbow, this is K. Okay, this seems kind of funny, but a lot of plots have something like this, where the cost function is, there are two parts, the upper arm, right, where the cost function is decreasing quickly, and then it kind of plateaus. Okay, and where it transitions from decreasing quickly to plateauing, that point is the elbow. Okay, so if the data set looks like this, right, you probably think, okay, the right answer is probably 4. If I were to pick only one cluster, I'm going to have a lot of cost from all the points that are not in the same cluster I picked the site from. If I pick 2, if this is like the optimal, still there are going to be a big decrease in cost as I added that site. And this will give me a big decrease in cost. This will give me a big decrease in cost. Up to k equals 4, I'm decreasing the cost a lot every time. But when I go from k equals 4 to k equals 5, right? If I add another site here, I'm not decreasing the cost very much. Okay? And so it's the change in the cost is gonna start plateauing. Okay, and probably the change is going to is monotonically going, usually it's monotonically decreasing, but typically the rate, if they're coming from underlying distributions like this, the rate of decline is also going to be kind of decreasing less and less every time. If you have fractal structure, someone mentioned fractal structure before. If you have fractal structure, you might get this weird thing where it is decreasing, plateauing, kind of decreasing, plateauing, decreasing, plateauing. And it'd be fun to think about some kind of examples where you can construct it where it looks like that. And then that's like a broken arm elbow. And there are multiple, but the point is there are multiple different answers there, right? There are multiple good choices of what the right value of k is. This could happen. I've worked with data sets that have this multiple levels of resolution that make sense. And then, well, depending on what level of resolution you want to look at, that determines the value of k that you care about, right? If I were to draw a data set that looked like okay, right? Either I can have 3 clusters, 1, 2, 3, and it would kind of plateau here, or I can pick 9 clusters, and this also makes sense. What's better, 6 or 3 clusters or 9 clusters? What's the right answer here? What? Yeah. So it depends on the scale of the data, the scale you want to look at the data, right? So there's not a single right answer here. This is a place where having these hierarchical clustering would be nice because you could see this nice hierarchy of things. So it's this one is going to have kind of the cost function that looks kind of like this broken arm, right? So where there's kind of like these 2 sort of elbows here, and it depends on the scale that you're interested to look at, right? Right, this is cost, and this is k. Okay, This is the green point, and this is kind of the red point. Okay. There's also another common thing that I'd say this is much more common than actually anything we've seen before. And this is where your data looks something like this. Okay. Okay, so this is kind of a data. This sort of thing happens a lot, maybe in 2D or in higher D, where I have two coordinates, and it's more common to be around 0. And then sometimes you get larger values. When looking at it, I often taught this. So I often taught the course in data mining, and tell people go find a data set and apply some algorithms and see what happens, part of a project. And people often come back to me with data sets that look like this and say, I ran clustering and I'm not very satisfied, right? You can run Lloyd's algorithm. It will choose some clusters, right, that look, like, it's going to give some answers. Okay, maybe it gives these 4 clusters. Okay, is that interesting? Are there 4 clusters there? Are there more clusters? I would say there aren't. The way k-means models clusters, this does not have any so meaningful clusters. If you look at this cost plot, where this is k, and I plot this, what's going to kind of happen is that you're going to get this curve that looks like this, where there's kind of like, like no, there's like no elbow in this plot. It's going to kind of, it's going to kind of start plateauing still, but there's not like a single point that you really, okay, I found all the clusters and now it's doing something at a scale that's a little bit so finer here. And so this isn't, this is not common. And looking at the cost plot and determining what has an elbow and what does not have an elbow is a little bit tricky to do. I drew some examples in the book. If you look in the book, there are some examples of 2 different types of these, but they're it's a little bit hard to distinguish between no elbow and a clear elbow. Okay, actually, before we break, let me do a collab really quick. Again, I don't recommend, implementing Lloyd's algorithm, the basic version, is actually pretty simple and straightforward, right? It's like you have a for loop, you have 2 lines inside the for loop. They're not that hard to do. And each line has you search for the closest point and you update it. I could ask you to do that, but there are all these weird things that you have to deal with. So, people have implemented this and dealt with all the weird things. I'm going to use, this, in this example, this built-in kind of machine learning library called scikit-learn, which is very popular in Python, has a lot of this stuff built into it. And so this one also has a way to make blobs. Okay, so I'm going to make these blobs here, and I've chosen, and it's going to generate 100 data points with 4 centers, a standard deviation of 1. And you can change the random state, and you can get some different blobs. Okay, and so there are kind of 4 clusters here. I've generated them in this way. So if I generate them randomly, just uniformly, they're not going to be clusters. So you need to start by actually having clusters. And then I run the clustering algorithm called k-means, and it's structured in this weird way where you give it this data set X, and the fit actually runs a version of Lloyd's algorithm, probably with k-means ++ and maybe random restarts, and then it assigns labels to all the points in X, and then I can plot them, right? And so I don't know why I'm rerunning these things, but you can see the pictures and the color. I've assigned the color based on the label SKM, the C and I've drawn the sites that I found in red at the center, right? So this worked really well. I picked these 4 sites. They're at kind of the average of all the points in the cluster, and I've identified them fairly well in this approach. Okay, great. So we'll stop here. On Thursday, we'll talk about mixture of Gaussians, which will give, it's a very kind of, it looks much more complicated, but it's a fairly simple extension of this that adds kind of a more formal probabilistic modeling onto what is going on underneath here. What do I actually mean by clusters? Okay, great.